I never believed in ghosts until I met Jane Doe. My name's Cornelius Blackthorne, and I've been working the graveyard shift at Mercy General's morgue for 12 years now. Most people think it's creepy work, but honestly, the dead are better company than most living folks. They don't complain, they don't make small talk, and they sure as hell don't ask for favors. It's peaceful down here in the basement, just me and the fluorescent lights humming their electric lullaby. Or at least it was peaceful. Everything changed last November when they brought her in. Jane Doe. That's what we called her since nobody knew who she was. River fishermen found her floating face down near the old industrial district, probably been in the water 3, maybe 4 days. No ID, no missing person reports, nothing. Just another forgotten soul in a city full of them. She looked maybe 35, with dark hair that had turned stringy from the water and skin that had that waxy, translucent quality the drowned ones get. Her eyes were cloudy, but there was something about her face that stuck with me. Even bloated and discolored, she looked familiar somehow. Like I'd seen her in a dream I couldn't quite remember. The first night she was here, I was doing paperwork around 3 a.m. when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft raps, like someone politely asking for permission to enter. I looked up from my clipboard, expecting to see Dr. Martinez, or maybe a late-arriving EMT, but the morgue door was closed tight. I shrugged it off. Old buildings make all kinds of noises, especially Mercy General with its pre-war plumbing and settling foundation. But then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time I realized the sound wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the refrigeration units along the far wall. Specifically from drawer 7, Jane Doe's drawer. I sat there for a full minute, pen frozen in my hand, waiting for another sound. Nothing. Just the familiar hum of the cooling system and my own heartbeat getting a little too loud in my ears. I told myself it was the expansion and contraction of metal as the unit cycled. Happens all the time. Except it had never happened before, not in 12 years. The next night, same thing. 3:17 a.m. I remember checking my watch, and those 3 knocks from drawer 7. This time I actually got up and walked over to the unit. The metal was cold under my palm, vibrating slightly from the compressor, but otherwise normal. I pulled the handle and slid the drawer out about 6 inches, just enough to peek inside. Jane Doe lay exactly as I'd left her, covered by the standard white sheet, toe tag dangling from her left foot. Her face was peaceful in that artificial way the dead sometimes look, like she was just sleeping off a bad dream. I studied her for a long moment, looking for anything that might explain the noise. Maybe decomposition gases causing movement? But she'd been refrigerated, slowing down the process considerably. I pushed the drawer closed and went back to my desk. The knocking didn't happen again that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside that steel box. By the 4th night, I was starting to lose sleep during my daytime hours. The knocking had become regular as clockwork. Always at 3:17, always 3 knocks, always from drawer 7. I'd tried everything I could think of. Checking the unit's mechanics, repositioning the body, even switching Jane Doe to a different drawer. Nothing worked. The sound followed her. That's when I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. Time, duration, intensity of the knocks. I even brought in a digital recorder, thinking maybe I could catch some electronic voice phenomenon, or at least have proof I wasn't going crazy. But the recorder picked up nothing except ambient noise and my own nervous breathing. The knocking was meant for me alone. On the 7th night, I decided to stay late and really observe what was happening. I positioned myself directly in front of drawer 7 with my notebook, pen ready, eyes fixed on my watch. 3:16, 3:17. Knock, knock, knock. But this time, something was different. The knock sounded urgent. Desperate, even. Like someone trapped inside, running out of air. I yanked the drawer open so fast it banged against its stops, the metallic clang echoing through the morgue. Jane Doe was gone. Not just moved or shifted, completely gone. The sheet was still there, spread flat as if no body had ever lain beneath it. The toe tag sat empty on the metal surface. I stared at the vacant drawer for what felt like hours, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. But the sound wasn't coming from drawer 7 anymore. It was coming from behind me. I turned around slowly, afraid of what I might see. Every single drawer in the morgue was open about 6 inches, creating a row of dark gaps like missing teeth in a skull's grin. And there, leading from the refrigeration units to the door I had locked from the inside hours earlier, were wet footprints. Small bare feet. A woman's footprints, with water still pooling in each impression. I followed the trail with my eyes, my legs refusing to move. The prints led directly to the morgue door, which now stood slightly ajar despite the fact that I distinctly remembered locking it. Cold air from the hallway beyond mixed with the artificial chill of the morgue, creating tiny whirlwinds of condensation that danced in the fluorescent light. I never found Jane Doe's body. The police investigation turned up nothing. No security footage, no signs of break-in, no explanation for how a corpse could simply vanish from a locked room. They questioned me for hours, convinced I'd made some kind of mistake or covered up negligence. But I knew what I'd seen. Or rather, what I hadn't seen. I requested a transfer the next morning. Now I work days at a funeral home across town, surrounded by living people and natural sunlight. But sometimes, usually around 3:17 in the morning when I can't sleep, I hear those 3 soft knocks echoing in my memory. And I wonder if Jane Doe ever found her way home. Story 2. They say the dead tell no tales, but I'm here to tell you that's bullshit. I'm Isadora Grimwald, and I've been preparing bodies for burial for 23 years. Started when I was 19, right out of mortuary school, and I've worked in every kind of facility you can imagine, small-town funeral homes, big city morgues, even a few places that probably shouldn't have been operating legally. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the basement morgue at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The place had a reputation. Other morticians would literally refuse to work alone down there, always insisting on a partner or claiming they needed to finish up before their shift ended. Management chalked it up to typical superstition. You know how funeral workers can be about bad juju and all that nonsense. But they were desperate for someone willing to take the night shift, and the pay bump was too good to pass up. My first week was actually pretty normal. Standard procedures, regular deliveries, nothing out of the ordinary except for how damn quiet it was. St. Bartholomew's basement morgue was originally built in the 1920s, back when they didn't really understand acoustics the way we do now. The room was all wrong. Too long, too narrow, with this weird curved ceiling that seemed to trap sound in strange ways. Even my footsteps echoed funny down there. The whispers started during my second week. At first, I thought it was the ventilation system. You know that sound old buildings make, like air moving through ducts that haven't been cleaned in decades? But this was different. If I stood really still and held my breath, I could almost make out words. It was probably around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when I first heard them clearly. I was working on an elderly woman who died in her sleep. Natural causes, peaceful passing, nothing traumatic about it. As I was setting her features, I heard what sounded like someone whispering behind me. Just fragments at first. Told you. And never should have. I spun around, expecting to see a coworker or maybe a security guard making rounds, but the morgue was empty. Just me and 3 bodies in various stages of preparation. The whispers stopped the moment I moved. Over the next few nights, it got worse. The whispers would start whenever I was alone with a body, always just at the edge of comprehension. Sometimes I'd catch names, dates, pieces of conversation that felt intensely personal. And here's the thing that really freaked me out. The whispers seemed to match the bodies I was working on. The elderly woman? I heard fragments about grandchildren, recipes, someone named Harold who promised to take care of the garden. A middle-aged man who died of a heart attack whispered about deadlines, mortgage payments, and apologizing to someone named Jennifer. Each body brought its own chorus of final thoughts, regrets, and unfinished business. I started keeping notes, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The whispers weren't random. They were specific, personal, like the last conscious thoughts of each person somehow trapped in that room's weird acoustic properties. I researched the building's history and found out the basement had originally been designed as a chapel, with that curved ceiling meant to carry prayers upward. Maybe it was carrying something else now. The breaking point came with David Chun, a 24-year-old suicide victim. Overdose, found in his apartment after missing work for 3 days. When they brought him in, he looked peaceful enough. Young guy, probably had his whole life ahead of him before whatever demons caught up with him. But the moment I started working on David, the whispers exploded. It wasn't just fragments anymore. It was full sentences, desperate pleading, a one-sided conversation that filled the entire room. Sarah, please pick up. Sarah, I know you're there. I'm sorry about what I said. I didn't mean it. Please don't leave me like this. The voice was so clear I actually looked around for a phone, thinking maybe his cell was still active and someone was calling. But there was nothing. Just David's body and that voice echoing off the curved ceiling, getting more desperate by the minute. I can't do this without you, Sarah. I know I screwed up. I love you so much. Please just call me back. I won't bother you anymore, I promise. Just tell me you don't hate me. I tried to focus on my work, but the voice kept getting louder, more frantic. Other whispers started joining in. The elderly woman asking about Harold, the heart attack victim apologizing to Jennifer, voices from bodies I'd worked on weeks ago. The room filled with a cacophony of final thoughts, regrets, love letters to people who would never hear them. David's voice rose above them all. I can't live with what I did to us, Sarah. I can't live knowing you hate me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That's when I understood. These weren't just random thoughts. They were the last conscious moments before death, somehow imprinted in that room like echoes in a cave. David's overdose wasn't accidental. It was a love letter written in desperation and sealed with pills. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers became screaming, overlapping voices of the dead pouring out their hearts to people who would never know how much they were loved, how sorry they felt, how desperately they wanted just one more chance to make things right. I ran out of that morgue at 3 a.m. and never went back. Requested an immediate transfer, didn't even finish out my notice. Management wasn't happy, but I didn't care. I couldn't spend another night listening to the last words of the dying, trapped forever in that acoustic tomb. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake sometimes. I've worked in 6 different morgues since leaving St. Bartholomew's, all over the state. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between 2 and 4 a.m., I still hear David's voice calling for Sarah. Last month, I looked her up online. Sarah Mitchell, David's ex-girlfriend. She's married now, has 2 kids, lives about 50 miles from here. Happy by all appearances. I wanted to call her, to tell her that David's last thoughts were of love, not anger. That he died wishing he could take back whatever hurt he'd caused. But what's the point? Some messages were never meant to be delivered. Some whispers are meant to stay trapped in the dark, carrying the weight of words that came too late. Still, on quiet nights like this, I find myself listening for that familiar voice, wondering if somewhere in the acoustic shadows of St. Bartholomew's basement, David Chun is still calling Sarah's name, hoping she'll finally pick up the phone. Story 3. In 30 years of mortuary science, I thought I'd seen every kind of mistake the system could make. Boy, was I wrong. Name's Thaddeus Ashworth, and I've been in this business since before digital records, back when everything was handwritten forms and carbon copies. I've dealt with mix-ups, clerical errors, bodies delivered to the wrong funeral home. Hell, I once had a family show up to view their deceased grandfather who turned out to be very much alive and playing poker in the hospital cafeteria. But what happened at Riverside Funeral Home last October? That defied every rule of logic I thought I understood. It started on a Tuesday morning when the transport van pulled up with what should have been a routine delivery. Car accident victim, Marcus Chin, 34 years old, pronounced dead at the scene after losing control on Highway 89 during a rainstorm. The paperwork looked standard: police report, coroner's examination, all the usual documentation that follows a traffic fatality. Marcus looked exactly like what you'd expect from a high-speed crash. Significant trauma to the head and torso, defensive wounds on his arms where he'd tried to brace for impact. His wallet had survived the accident mostly intact, along with his driver's license, showing a decent-looking Asian-American guy with a slight smile and kind eyes. The kind of face that made you wonder about the life cut short, whether he had kids, what his last thoughts were, that sort of thing. I processed him according to standard procedure. Photographed the body, documented visible injuries, ran the usual tests to determine the best approach for reconstruction. Marcus would need extensive work before his family could have an open casket service, but I'd handled worse. The man deserved to look peaceful for his final goodbye. 3 days later, I'm finishing up paperwork when another transport van arrives. The delivery driver looks confused, checking his clipboard twice before approaching my desk. "Got a Marcus Chun for you," he says, handing over the documentation. I look at the paperwork, and my blood goes cold. Same name, same age, same identification numbers. Same coroner's signature, same police case number, same everything. But this couldn't be right. Marcus Chun was already in cold storage, waiting for his family to finalize funeral arrangements. "There must be some mistake," I tell the driver. "We already received Marcus Chun 3 days ago." The guy shrugs. "I just deliver him, man. This is what they gave me at the hospital. I walk out to the van, and when they open the back door, I see another body bag with Marcus Chen's name on the tag. This has to be clerical error. Probably two different victims with similar names got mixed up in the system. Happens more often than you'd think. But when I unzipped the bag, my hands started shaking. It was Marcus Chen. Same face, same build, same distinctive scar on his left shoulder that I'd noted in my original documentation. But this Marcus looked different. The injuries were wrong. Not car accident trauma, but older wounds that had partially healed before death. His clothes were different too, worn and dirty like he'd been living rough for weeks. His fingernails were longer, his hair grown out, and he had a scraggly beard that the first Marcus definitely hadn't had. I immediately called the hospital, thinking maybe they'd sent us the wrong body by mistake. But the records department insisted they'd only released one Marcus Chen, the car accident victim from Tuesday. I called the coroner's office, the police department, even the DMV. Everyone had the same story. One Marcus Chen, age 34, died in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 89. Yet here I was, staring at two bodies bearing identical identification, identical documentation, identical everything except for their physical condition and apparent time of death. I ran every test I could think of. Fingerprints, perfect match. Dental records, identical. Both bodies had the same surgical scar from an appendectomy, the same birthmark on the back of the neck, even the same old break in the left wrist that had healed slightly crooked. By every measure medical science recognizes, these were the same person. But that was impossible. I kept the second Marcus in a separate cooler while I tried to figure out what to do. The first Marcus's funeral was scheduled for Saturday, and his family had already made all the arrangements. I couldn't exactly call them up and say, "Hey, we've got a spare copy of your dead relative. Which one would you like to bury?" So I made a decision that probably violated about 6 different regulations. I proceeded with the original funeral service, using the first Marcus, the car accident victim who looked like he'd died recently and cleanly. The family said their goodbyes, the service was beautiful, and we laid Marcus Chen to rest in Greenwood Cemetery. Meanwhile, the second Marcus remained in cold storage. I kept hoping someone would come forward with an explanation, maybe a twin brother nobody knew about, or some kind of witness protection situation. But days turned into weeks, and nobody came looking for the other Marcus Chen. I started losing sleep, checking on that second body every night before going home. He looked so much older than the first one, like he'd lived through months or years of hardship that the original Marcus had never experienced. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if this was what the first Marcus would have become if he'd survived the accident. Homeless, desperate, eventually dying alone in some alley or abandoned building. Then one morning, about 6 weeks after the funeral, I arrived at work to find the second cooler empty. No signs of break-in. No disturbance to the locks or security system. The surveillance cameras showed nothing unusual. Just me, working alone through the night, as if the duplicate Marcus Chen had never existed at all. Even the paperwork had vanished from my files, leaving no trace that a second body had ever been delivered. I searched everywhere, called every contact I could think of, but it was like that other Marcus had simply evaporated. The only proof I had were my own memories and a few photos I'd taken from my personal files. Photos that now showed nothing but empty steel tables and blank identification tags. The police wrote it off as a clerical error, probably a mix-up in the hospital's database that got corrected automatically. The insurance company assumed I'd misplaced some paperwork. Everyone had a rational explanation for what couldn't be rationally explained. But I know what I saw. I know I held 2 death certificates for the same man, prepared 2 identical bodies that had died different deaths, lived different final months of the same life. And sometimes, late at night when I'm locking up the funeral home, I wonder if somewhere out there, Marcus Chen is still dying in different ways, creating new versions of himself that only I seem able to see. Makes you think about the nature of mortality, doesn't it? What if death isn't as final as we think? What if every choice creates another version of ourselves, and sometimes those versions bleed through into our reality? I've never told this story to anyone before. Most people would think I was losing my mind, and maybe I am. But every time I see a car accident on the news, I find myself checking the victim's name, wondering if I'll get another delivery that shouldn't exist. After all, if it happened once, who's to say it won't happen again? Story 4. Artists see the world differently, even in death. I learned that the hard way when Lucius Hartwell arrived at our facility. I'm Ophelia Ravenscroft. I've been working in mortuary science for 15 years now, and I've prepared bodies of all kinds: doctors, teachers, construction workers, even a few minor celebrities. But artists? They're different. Something about the creative process changes them on a fundamental level, leaves traces that don't fade even after the heart stops beating. Lucius Hartwell was a painter, pretty well known in local circles. Did these incredible abstract pieces that sold for more money than I make in 6 months. The gallery downtown had a whole wall dedicated to his work. Swirling colors that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. Landscapes that felt more real than reality itself. He died in his studio, apparently working on what his agent called his masterpiece. Heart attack, they said, probably brought on by the stress of an upcoming exhibition. When they found him 3 days later, he was slumped over his easel, brush still clutched in his right hand, surrounded by canvases covered in colors I'd never seen before. And I mean never. I've got a degree in art history alongside my mortuary science certification, so I know my pigments. But the paints on Lucius's final works seemed to shimmer and shift in the light, like they were alive somehow. The paramedics said the paint was still wet when they found him, even though he'd been dead for days. When they brought him to our funeral home, the first thing I noticed was his hands. Usually rigor mortis sets in pretty uniformly, muscles contract, joints lock up, everything becomes rigid. But Lucius's right hand remained flexible, fingers curved as if he was still gripping a brush. I tried to straighten them for presentation, but they'd spring back to that painting position every time. The second thing I noticed were the stains under his fingernails. Not regular paint. This stuff seemed to glow with its own inner light. I tried to clean it off during preparation, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the paint had bonded with his skin at a molecular level. Then the marks started appearing. I first noticed them on the second day. Small spots of color on his torso, just below the sternum. Nothing dramatic, just a few dots of that same impossible paint I'd seen under his nails. I figured maybe I'd missed some spatter during the initial cleaning, made a note to be more thorough. But the next morning, there were more marks. Not spots now, but deliberate strokes, broad sweeps of color that formed abstract patterns across his chest and arms. The strangest part was that the colors seemed to shift depending on the angle of light, cycling through hues that don't exist in any traditional palette. I documented everything, took photographs, even called in Dr. Martinez for a second opinion. But the weird thing was, the camera only captured normal post-mortem discoloration. In the photos, Lucius looked like any other body in the early stages of decomposition. The impossible colors, the artistic patterns, they were visible only to the naked eye. By the third day, the patterns had evolved into something more complex. What started as abstract swirls had become recognizable forms. Faces emerging from the brushstrokes, landscapes blooming across his skin. I found myself spending hours just watching the colors shift and change, mesmerized by the artistry unfolding on his body. The faces were the most disturbing part. Some looked familiar. I recognized what might have been Lucius's mother from a photograph his sister had brought for the funeral service. Others were strangers, but they all had this expression of profound sadness, like they were trying to communicate something urgent. I started researching Lucius's work, trying to understand what was happening. His paintings had always been abstract, but in his final months, he'd been experimenting with something he called living pigments. Paints that he claimed could capture not just color, but emotion, memory, even consciousness itself. His studio notebooks, which his sister let me read, were filled with references to painting with souls and pigments that remember. The last entry, dated the day he died, simply said, "The canvas is ready. Time to become the art." On the final night before the funeral, I arrived at work to find something that made my blood run cold. Lucius wasn't lying flat on the preparation table anymore. Somehow, impossibly, his body had moved to a sitting position, right hand extended toward the wall as if he was painting in the air. But he wasn't painting air. On the wall behind him, rendered in those same impossible colors, was a mural of our funeral home's preparation room. Every detail was perfect: the steel tables, the fluorescent lights, the cabinets full of embalming supplies. And there, in the center of the mural, was my own face staring back at me with an expression of absolute terror. The paint was still wet. I could see it glistening in the fluorescent light, dripping slowly down the wall like tears. And when I touched Lucius's extended hand, it was warm. Not the artificial warmth of the heating system, but the organic heat of living flesh. I ran from that room and didn't come back until morning, when the funeral director and Lucius's family arrived for the service. The wall was clean, white as hospital sheets, showing no trace of the mural. Lucius lay peacefully on his table, hands folded properly across his chest, looking exactly like any other body prepared for burial. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm working late and the funeral home is quiet, I catch glimpses of color moving in my peripheral vision. Brush strokes of impossible paint decorating the walls, floors, even the ceiling. Like Lucius is still creating, still painting his masterpiece on the canvas of reality itself. The strangest part is that I've started to appreciate it. There's a beauty in those phantom colors, a depth that regular paint could never achieve. It's like Lucius found a way to paint with pure emotion, to create art that exists beyond the physical world. Sometimes I wonder if that was his plan all along, to become his own masterpiece, to merge so completely with his art that death became just another medium to explore. And when I see those impossible colors dancing in the corners of my vision, I can't help but think that maybe, just maybe, he succeeded. After all, what is death but the ultimate transformation? And what is art but the attempt to capture something eternal in a world of temporary things? Lucius Hartwell may be gone, but his final work continues. Every day, every night, painting beauty onto a canvas that extends far beyond the boundaries of life and death. Story 5. Some deaths leave behind mysteries, but Ezra Morozov left behind an entire universe of them. My name is Barnabas Crowthorne, and I've been preparing the dead for burial for 18 years. In that time, I've handled suicides, murders, accidents, natural deaths, every way a person can leave this world. But I've never encountered anyone quite like Ezra Morozov, the old antique dealer who died alone in his Victorian mansion on Elm Street. The authorities found him in his study, slumped over a leather-bound ledger that appeared to catalog every item in his enormous collection. Heart failure, the coroner said, probably brought on by his advanced age and the stress of maintaining such a vast inventory. The man was 93, though he looked much older when they brought him to me. What made Ezra unusual wasn't how he died, but what he carried with him. When I began the standard preparation process, I noticed his clothing felt unusually heavy. Not just the weight of expensive fabric, but something more substantial. As I carefully removed his antique three-piece suit, I discovered the source. Dozens of small objects sewn into hidden pockets throughout the lining. At first glance, they looked like typical antique jewelry and coins, the kind of thing you'd expect an old collector to keep close. But as I examined each piece more carefully, I realized these weren't just old. They were impossibly old, and in pristine condition despite their apparent age. There was a Roman denarius that looked like it had been minted yesterday, a medieval ring with inscriptions in Latin that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, and a pocket watch that ticked backwards, its hands moving counterclockwise through hours that didn't exist on any normal timepiece. The strangest part was how they felt in my hands. Each object carried a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass, an emotional heaviness, like they were saturated with the memories of everyone who had ever owned them. When I held the Roman coin, I caught flashes of ancient marketplaces, the sound of chariot wheels on cobblestones, the smell of burning incense in forgotten temples. I should have stopped there, should have cataloged the items and turned them over to Ezra's estate executor. But something compelled me to keep examining them, to understand what kind of man accumulates such impossible artifacts. That's when I discovered his pockets weren't just full, they were impossibly deep. I'm talking about coat pockets that should have been maybe 6 inches deep, but my entire forearm would disappear into them without reaching the bottom. And the items I pulled out, they kept coming. Hundreds of objects from every period of human history, each one carrying its own burden of memory and meaning. A Bronze Age spearhead that whispered of tribal warfare. A Renaissance locket containing a miniature portrait that aged before my eyes. An Egyptian scarab that felt warm to the touch, as if it still carried desert sand from the pyramids. Each piece told its story through sensation alone, flooding my mind with visions of lives lived and lost across millennia. As I worked through the night, cataloging each impossible artifact, I began to understand what Ezra Morozov really was. He wasn't just an antique dealer. He was a collector of moments, a curator of human experience preserved in objects that somehow transcended the normal flow of time. His ledger, which I'd initially assumed was a simple inventory, turned out to be something far more complex. Each entry included not just the object's description and acquisition date, but detailed notes about its temporal resonance and memorial capacity. Some items were marked as active, others as dormant, and a few carried warnings in Ezra's spidery handwriting. Handle with extreme caution, and never exposed to direct sunlight. The most disturbing entries were in the back of the book, under a section titled Future Acquisitions. These pages contained descriptions of objects that hadn't been created yet, people who were still alive, events that hadn't happened. And at the very bottom of the last page, in ink that looked fresher than the rest, was an entry that made my hands shake. Barnabas Crowthorne, Mortician, professional mourner of the unclaimed dead. Acquired date illegible. Temporal signature, stable. Memorial capacity, exceptional. Notes. Subject possesses natural sensitivity to historical resonance. Ideal candidate for collection expansion. Below that, in the same fresh ink, was today's date followed by a single word, collected. I dropped the ledger and stepped back from Ezra's body, my heart racing. This had to be some kind of elaborate hoax, a practical joke played by a senile old man with too much time and money. But when I looked at Ezra's face, I could swear I saw the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Then I felt it in my jacket pocket, a weight that hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, I reached inside and pulled out a business card. My business card, printed just 6 months ago with the funeral home's contact information. But this card was yellow with age, brittle as ancient parchment, and on the back, in Ezra's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "Added to collection, Barnabas Crowthorne Mortician died." The date was tomorrow. I stared at that impossible card for what felt like hours, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But the objects scattered around Ezra's body seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, whispering their stories of previous owners who had become part of something larger, something that transcended individual existence. That was 3 days ago. I'm writing this account now because I need someone to know what happened here, what's still happening. The card in my pocket feels heavier each day, and I've started seeing things, flashes of other times, other places, other versions of myself living different lives in different centuries. Yesterday, I found a new object in my apartment, a fountain pen that writes in languages I don't recognize. Today, it was a compass that points not north, but towards some destination I can't identify. I think I'm becoming part of Ezra's collection, joining the legion of souls preserved in artifacts that remember everything and forget nothing. The strangest part is that I'm not entirely sure I mind. There's something appealing about becoming part of something eternal, about having your experiences preserved forever in objects that will outlast civilizations. Maybe this is what Ezra discovered in his 93 years, that death isn't an ending, but a transformation into something more permanent than flesh and blood. If you're reading this, and if something happens to me tomorrow, know that I chose this. When the authorities find my body, they'll probably discover the same impossible pockets, the same collection of artifacts spanning impossible years. And maybe, just maybe, they'll find someone like me to carry on the work. After all, someone has to collect the moments. Someone has to preserve the memories of the dead in objects that remember long after human memory fails. The collection must continue, and now I understand. I'm not just its next curator. I'm its newest addition.